Welcome. In 1967, in the journal Science, historian Lynn White published The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis. Its thesis was simple. As he wrote in his concluding paragraph, both our present science and our present technology are so tinctured with orthodox Christian arrogance toward nature that no solution for our ecologic crisis can be expected from them alone. White located the origins of this arrogance in medieval approaches to the biblical book of Genesis. But it should be emphasized that he was not criticizing Christians from the outside. Rather, he was himself a Christian, and therefore his article is best thought of as an address or even a plea made to his fellow believers. Today, we'll unpack White's article and survey both its influence and responses to it. Before we turn back to White, let's unpack the larger historical context. The 1960s saw key developments that fed into the burgeoning environmental movement. But not all developments originated in that decade. At least one was older: the fear of nuclear war and nuclear fallout, which intensified during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 and which lasted for the duration of the Cold War. But the 1960s rapidly saw a series of new developments. One was Rachel Carson's influential book, Silent Spring. In it, Carson detailed the harmful effects of DDT. Many people subsequently saw Silent Spring as the beginning of the environmental movement itself. This is overstated, but the influence of Silent Spring should not be underestimated. Soon, the 1960s also saw concerns about the environmental impact of chemical warfare, especially during the Vietnam War. Then, in 1970, the first Earth Day was celebrated, and the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, was created that same year. The Endangered Species Act followed in 1973, signifying that environmental concern was now a permanent feature of modern society and American politics. White's article appeared almost smack dab in the middle of all of this. It was published 5 years after Silent Spring, but 3 years before the creation of the EPA, and 6 years before the Endangered Species Act. White argued that, historically, there were two major shifts. One was the transition from paganism to Christianity. He writes, "By destroying pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects. Initially, Christians saw in nature not spirits residing in things, such as trees or streams. Rather, Christians saw in nature signs left by God. Thus, nature was like a web of spiritual meaning. But, according to White, this began to change in the 13th century. To quote him again, in the Latin West, by the early 13th century, natural theology was following a very different bent. It was ceasing to be the decoding of the physical symbols of God's communication with man, and was becoming the effort to understand God's mind by discovering how his creation operates. This ultimately gave rise to modern science and technology, but also the exploitative attitude that White saw in his own day. Because White believed that Western Christianity bore much of the blame for environmental destruction, it's easy to miss a crucial fact about his article. He didn't think that the solution was to become more secular. Rather, he thought the solution was, at least in part, also religious. The last section of his essay was entitled, "An Alternative Christian View." So, it wasn't non-Christian or post-Christian or secular, as he wrote in his final paragraph. Since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, The remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. And for White, that religious remedy was found in the 13th century Catholic saint Francis of Assisi. According to Catholic tradition, St. Francis was known for preaching to animals as well as humans. According to White, the key to an understanding of Francis is his belief in the virtue of humility, not merely for the individual, but for man as a species. In other words, according to White, a fundamentally Christian problem had a fundamentally Christian solution, but it was one that Christians had quite disastrously overlooked. And thus, he concluded his essay by calling for St. Francis of Assisi to be made the patron saint of ecologists, a point that we will soon return to. White's article inspired, or perhaps provoked, a number of responses. You might call these counter-theses. Here we'll cover two. One is the thesis of stewardship. The other is the thesis of desacralization. And these weren't restricted to responses in the United States. We'll start by leaping across the Atlantic Ocean to the British Isles. In 1971, recognizing growing environmental concern, Michael Ramsey, the Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed a committee in the Church of England to study the topic. Its goal was, in his words, to investigate the relevance of Christian doctrine to the problems of man in his environment. 3 years later, having completed their work, they published Man and Nature, which contained their report, together with several essays. One of the essays was a direct response to Lynn White and authored by Arthur Peacock, a biochemist and theologian. Peacock countered in two ways. One was to note that, whatever their beliefs about nature, non-Christian societies were no more ecologically concerned than Christian societies. This is a point that others also made, and one that White never really considered. Second, Peacock drew examples from the wider Christian tradition that instead taught that humankind was called to care for nature in a benevolent fashion. Man is a trustee, steward, and manager for that which is not his own, and which is of value for its own sake to God. For God delights in all that he has made, and not in man alone. Emphasizing stewardship was one way of trying to counter the destructive attitude that White detected among his contemporaries. But stewardship was not the only counter-thesis. Another counter-thesis was that of desacralization. From this view, the real problem was something that White noted only in passing, namely, that the Western world was becoming post-Christian. So, a restatement of religious values was needed, albeit one attuned to present concerns. One example of this comes from the evangelical Christian Francis Schaeffer. In his 1970 book, Pollution and the Death of Man, he writes, God treats his creation with integrity. If God treats his creation in that way, should we not treat our fellow creatures with a similar integrity? And he concludes, loving the lover who made it, I have respect for the thing he has made. This isn't far removed from the idea of stewardship, although it locates the problem differently. But the argument against desacralization has since become an argument for what is called resacralization. In other words, the desacralization thesis is also the resacralization thesis. A good example of this comes from the Muslim theologian and scholar Syed Hossein Nasr in his book Religion and the Order of Nature. Nature needs to be resacralized, not by man, who has no power to bestow the quality of sacredness on anything, but through remembrance of what nature is as theater of divine creativity and presence. Resacralization is therefore a return to something allegedly forgotten. It's difficult to overstate the influence of White's essay. In the decades since its publication, numerous journal articles have cited it, drawn inspiration from it, and used it as a springboard for more recent analyses of the relationship between religion and nature. White's article has been reprinted in a number of books and received extended discussion in academic studies. But as you might imagine, not everyone agrees with White's analysis. For example, it's one of the first works that Mark Stoll discusses in his book, Inherit the Holy Mountain, which studies the religious background of American environmentalism. In some ways, Stoll's book challenges White's thesis because it nuances the discussion, noting how the larger history of American Christianity, especially what we now call mainline Protestantism, has often been permeated with a concern for the natural order. But White's essay remains important. You'll find it in the reference matter of multiple academic histories. One recent example is Jacob Hamlin's book, Arming Mother Nature: The Birth of Catastrophic Environmentalism. Hamlin includes White among a list of influential figures from the 1960s who, writing in the wake of the first atomic bombs, feared that human beings would soon usher in the demise of the natural order. But White's greatest influence is undoubtedly in the area of religion, and Catholic Christianity in particular. In 1979, Pope John Paul II declared St. Francis of Assisi the patron saint of ecologists. So, even if you disagree with White's thesis, there's no escaping his very long shadow. So what? One reason for White's abiding influence is because he wrote his article at a time when people urgently needed to explain humanity's responsibility for not just ecological problems, but the very real possibility of human extinction. White's proposal is not the only possible answer. The counter-theses of stewardship and desacralization are other possibilities. And as time went on, still other scholars sought their answers in still other historical eras. For example, in her influential book, The Death of Nature, which was published in 1980, historian Carolyn Merchant argued that it was really the scientific revolution that bequeathed to later generations an exploitative attitude toward nature. Here the problem was not really religion, but science itself. And since then, still other explanations have arisen. For example, when it comes to climate change, the Industrial Revolution looms large, because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. The 1960s saw a rapid growth in environmental concern, and thus saw the beginnings of recurring attempts at explaining how humanity had come to a point where we could not only destroy ourselves, but the very planet we live on. If you're interested in learning more, these works are worth consulting. There's no full-scale study of either White or the historical roots of our ecologic crisis, but there is a collection of essays on White and his most famous work. It's entitled Religion and Ecologic Crisis, the Lynn White Thesis at 50. It's edited by Todd Levasseur and Anna Peterson. If my discussion of Anglican responses to White was of interest, you can read a fuller discussion in my essay, The Sacramental Universe: Theologies of Nature in North Atlantic Anglicanism, 1922 to 2012. It appears in the book Costly Communion, Ecumenical Initiative, and Sacramental Strife in the Anglican Communion, which is edited by Jeremy Bonner and Mark Chapman. And finally, there are multiple works that argue for what I've called the Desacralization thesis. Two that I discussed earlier are Francis Schaeffer's Pollution and the Death of Man, and then Syed Hussein Nasser's Religion and the Order of Nature. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.